Welcome to Crying Out Cloud, the podcast that will make you laugh, cry, and reconsider all of your cloud security fears. I'm Eden from the CTO team at Wiz, and I'm here with my amazing co-host, Amitai.
Hello.
And we have a very special guest today that we are really pumped to introduce you to, Tanya Janca.
Hi.
So Tanya, also known as She Hacks Purple, currently runs education and community at Semgrep. She is the author of Alice and Bob Learn Application Security and the founder of We Hack Purple. She's worked with startups, public service, tech giants like Microsoft, Adobe, Nokia. She's an award-winning speaker, blogger, and advocate for diversity and inclusion. And we are so lucky that she is joining us here. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm pretty excited to be here.
Yay! Where are you calling us from? Where are you right now?
I am in my home just outside Victoria, British Columbia in Canada. So if you hear an accent, that's what it is.
Lovely. I don't think we've ever had a Canadian guest before, have we, Amitai?
Maybe we had secret Canadian guests.
They hid their identity.
You can tell if they say about instead of about.
I mean, I'm originally Canadian, but I think I don't have an accent anymore.
I don't think I have an accent either, but many people have confirmed that I do.
Good to know. Amazing. So one of the things we like to do when we start off episodes with guests, just to get to know them a little bit and, get it started, is we like to do a speed round where we ask you fun questions before we get into the more technical and deep questions. Are you up for it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So the first one, in lieu of you being Canadian, is it true that Canadians are really nice?
It is true that we are very polite, and some of us are really nice, but it turns out there's at least 3 jerks in Canada.
We need at least 3. What can we do without them?
Has Canada ever attempted to weaponize its politeness somehow on the global arena?
I feel like if anything, we weaponize our irrelevantness because politically we're somewhat irrelevant generally as a whole. And so we use that so that then we can do things like peacekeeping and other things. So we're able to kind of go places that other countries can't go because generally we don't do any wrong. We don't do a lot of right either. We're just like kind of neutral. And so people tend to let us into lots of places.
Amazing.
Why are you called She Hacks Purple?
Okay, so that is a really good one. So when I went to go make a Twitter account, it was during the WannaCry outbreak. And basically I was at a conference and I kept looking over my friend Shannon Leet's shoulder at her Twitter to see what was happening. And she said, at some point you'll have to grow up and be a real adult InfoSec professional and get your own Twitter account. And so she's like, did you know they're free? Yes. And so I went to make one and my email was She Hacks Computers. So I thought I would just use that, but that was too long. So I had to change it. And people kept calling me Purple Team all the time because I couldn't decide between penetration testing and Red Team. And then the rest of application security, which is rather defensive. And so I was like, I don't know, She Hacks Purple. It's not like anyone's ever going to follow me. And then it just stuck. And I went to a meetup one day to speak, and my friend Kevin said, you're called She Hacks Purple, and then you don't even have purple hair or anything. So the next time I knew I would see him, I dyed my hair purple, and his reaction was amazing. And so it just went from there. It's all Kevin's fault, really.
That's phenomenal. We had an idea. We were like, it's because she doesn't want to associate with red or blue team. She's like, I got my own team.
No, if anything, I like both too much and couldn't choose.
Amazing. Speaking of these meetups, you get to go to a lot of conferences, and you've spoken at your fair share. Which conference are you most looking forward to in the next year?
So I don't think it's a very big secret that the OWASP conferences are my favorite conferences. And actually 2 weeks ago, I was at the OWASP Global AppSec Conference in San Francisco, and I was given a Lifetime Distinguished Member Award after volunteering for them for over 10 years. And so every single OWASP conference. And so I'm speaking at LastCon in 2 weeks. So just, that's my community. Those are my people. So yeah, every single one of their conferences are always my favorite.
One question we really like to ask people is if you were a vulnerability, what would you be?
Oh, oh my gosh. I never thought of that before. That's very interesting. Ooh, maybe I would be crossing trust boundaries.
Ooh, love.
Oh.
Amazing. We don't know you well enough yet, but we love that for you.
Well, it's the idea of, when you bring tainted information into your system, and then how do you handle that carefully to basically make sure it's not tainted anymore, or it's at a risk level that you are confident, like you've analyzed it to the point where you've decided you feel you're going to treat it as untainted.
Mm-hmm.
Although we know sometimes things escape, but generally we get this right. Well, okay, generally we get this wrong, but we're moving towards getting this right all the time. And so crossing trust boundaries means basically you've tracked something sensitive across where you're not supposed to.
Rad. Okay. On that note, I think it was fun speed round. We're gonna dive in a little bit deeper. So one of the things that's amazing about your trajectory is you've launched your own AppSec program. You've been a pen tester, been a developer. You've led education, high-level executive and board positions around security. You've seen it from so many angles. I'd love to hear from you. What is your process for building content? Like, what drives you to do this messaging? What kind of jumps out at you these days? And how do you choose what to focus on?
It's funny because I have a lot of people ask me, they're like, I don't know what to write about. I'm like, oh my gosh, if I had more time in the day, I would create 10 times more content. So every time people ask me something, I feel the need to make a piece of content, unless it's something very, very specific. Or if it's about me, I'm like, oh, we don't need content about me. Or I don't think we do. But so, for instance, I gave 2 talks yesterday. And at the end, one of them, there were just so many questions scrolling all down the chat. Like, we ran out of time, and we went over time. And so what I did was I copied the whole chat. And my plan is to make a video for every single one of the questions to answer them and just share it with everyone, because lots of people want to know those things. And so then if I get asked the same thing a few times, I'm like, well, that means a lot of people care about this. And so maybe I need to write a blog post or even a blog series about it. And then if enough people struggle with something, I'm like, I think I need to make a conference talk about this, especially if I find myself repeating the answer to many different clients. So I work at Semgrep full time, running their community and education efforts and developer relations as well, and all sorts of weird other things. But then on the side, I also consult at a place called IANS Research, and I do that so I know what to write my talks about. And through them, I've worked with almost 400 different AppSec teams. And so by having these weekly calls with so many different companies, you end up seeing trends about what teams are worried about, what CISOs are worried about, what AppSec programs are struggling with. And so then I'm like, oh, well, 10 of my clients have this problem. Obviously, I have to address it so I can help more people. And so it sounds weird, but I'm just trying really hard to be helpful.
It kind of reminds me of how Feynman, the physicist, so he used to give talks, and then his students made a book out of his lectures. They basically made notes of his lectures, and then they made a book out of his lectures. So that was the first thought about what you were saying. So I don't know how you mentioned sort of the steps of, okay, I'll write a blog post, I'll give a conference. I guess the highest level is I'll write a book about it.
Which she's also done.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, yes, my new book, I just submitted my last chapter, and it comes out in February of next year.
Exciting. What's this next book about?
It's called Alice and Bob Learn Secure Coding. And so I cover agnostic advice for every single type of language and framework. And then I cover 10 different programming languages, 9 different programming frameworks. And then I talk about many types of technologies. So serverless, WebSockets, APIs, IoT, and how to secure each one of them. And then because I cannot help myself and I learned so much since my first book, the last part of the book is the secure system development lifecycle. But all of it's from a developer perspective, because I was, even though I've done security 10 years, I was still a developer way longer. I was professionally developing for 17 years. And then I coded years before that as a teenager. And so I still feel like a dev, if that makes sense. And so I tried to focus so what is a threat modeling session like if you're a developer and you're attending one for the first time, and what should you bring with you, and what is it going to be like, and what do you need to do? And so it's sort of on the receiving end of the system development lifecycle, if that makes sense, and try to help them participate and be comfortable and also just have a good time, if that makes sense.
Totally. I want to read it. I'm curious if there are common technical misconceptions developers have. If there's a few that you want to share that kind of come up in the book as themes, maybe.
Well, I would say that if anything, software developers are being trained incorrectly every single time. When they go to college, when they go to university, when they do a boot camp, they're being taught, literally, if you read the lessons, quite often I'm you are literally teaching them to implement cross-site scripting. If you look at the Hello World lesson, so every single programming language, the very first lesson ever is Hello World. And whenever I create a new a new account on a new social media platform, my first post is always Hello World, right? This is how we start. And so you post, you learn how to make a program that compiles, that posts to the screen Hello World. The next step is always how to get input from the user. And so they're what is your name? And then you reflect it back to the screen without any input validation, without any output encoding, without any knowledge of perhaps this is dangerous. And then you reflect it back to the screen, and that's reflected cross-site scripting right there. And as they teach them to develop, they teach them how to do it wrong quite regularly. And so I would say it's not a misconception that they're struggling with, it's that they're literally taught how to do it incorrectly. Could you imagine if electricians went to trade school and they taught them? So I don't know if you've ever fixed things in your house or changed a lighting feature, but I flipped 2 houses when I was younger. I'm very handy. Yeah, I've retarred my own roof, installed toilets, and done all sorts of things like hardwood. Hardwood's hard. But so when you change a light fixture, you have to put the the wires together, you twist them, and then you put electrical tape, then you put a moret on top. So 2 different safety features to make sure it doesn't set your house on fire. But what they're teaching software developers is just twist those wires, push it in the wall. It'll probably be fine. Houses only burn down 1 every 100 times. They're literally teaching them incorrectly. And so I would say the misconception is that they're being taught correctly, or safely. And so I'm hoping with this new book that more universities and more colleges will pick it up. I'm also going to do free lessons on the internet like I did with my first book. So every month of 2021, I did a different chapter, and I had all sorts of friends on my streams. And for a few hours, we lectured the chapter. So I was if universities aren't going to teach it, well, I'm going to teach it. Because I was very frustrated with universities not picking it up. And they're well, you could come teach it as an adjunct professor. And I don't know if you know, but adjunct professors, they're paid less than minimum wage.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry. No, I'm not going to come teach for a place that makes millions and millions of dollars of profit per year for free. It's not a volunteer position. It's if I had a PhD, you would pay me quite well, but you don't feel I'm a real person and I'm not fitting into your academic pyramid.
They should find an AI bot to teach it.
That would be great.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that by teaching it for free on the internet, I can help move our industry forward. So I know that I answered your question a very weird way, but I don't think it's that developers are wrong. I think it's that they've been taught to do it wrong, and they're following the way they've been taught, and they're just sort of being set up to fail, and that's not fair.
We sometimes find like mistakes in policies and in configurations of all sorts of applications in our research. And it's interesting to see that oftentimes you can trace it back to like a single tutorial that everybody's following on the internet. And then like we reach out to the person who wrote the tutorial and say like, okay, you need to change this because this is causing like everybody to make the same mistake. So it's interesting that the same thing can happen in universities where you'd hope that wouldn't be the case.
When I worked at Microsoft, they launched Microsoft Learn, and I made some modules there. And I remember going through all my colleagues' modules and being so annoying with them. I'm like, you can't put star dot star. No, no. And they're like, well, it's just an example. I'm like, people will copy and paste what you put into their production code.
Yeah.
And they're like, no one would do that. I'm like, literally everyone would do that. 2 months ago, I went on Stack Overflow and I tried to answer every single Semgrep question because I work at Semgrep and I want those questions answered. So I'm like, I'll answer them all in one day. That's what I'll do today. So some of the questions were like, how do I suppress this result? And then I read their code. I'm like, you have cross-site scripting. You don't want to suppress this result. Here's how you can fix your code. And then I got downvoted because people were like, you didn't answer their question. Like, what? And so apparently I was not being well behaved by answering not the way they wanted me to, because they're like, what they asked was how to suppress this, or what they asked was this, or I asked for elaboration. So I'm like, you've asked this question, but we need to know these 3 things, or like, we need to see your code in order to give you a better answer. And they're just like, no, that's a comment, not a question. And so anyway, I'm banned for life now. So I I will figure it out. I will make another account. I will answer those questions. But I feel like when we have systems like that, where I'm downvoted by pointing out, no, you actually have cross-site scripting in that code. It's not that you want to suppress the scanner's result. It's that you need to change your code. And that's downvoted and I am blocked. What? How can us security folks do a good job?
Yeah.
So I am going to write them and see what I can do about that. And just to be clear, like, I still love Stack Overflow. I still use it all the time, but I'm cautious with the answers. It's not always the most secure way to do the thing you want to do. And so I feel like we have a lot of work to do, a lot of work. And I can't, and if you can correct one tutorial, that's fantastic. But oh my gosh, that's a lot of effort for us to try to chase all the people around.
Yeah. And then, you have that sort of popping up now in AI generated code where, if someone makes a mistake in something that's common enough or popular enough, then you're going to have that repeated in the AI as results. And then you're going to have a lot of people making buggy code as well. So it'll be interesting to see like how the industry sort of adapts to that, because I don't think we'll be able to accept just, as a matter of life that code is buggy now by default.
No, I don't think it's reasonable. And I also feel that software developers don't think that's reasonable either. I don't think that's what they want either. I think I've heard a lot of security professionals say like, they don't care about security, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, actually, I'm sure they do, but I'm also sure that they're told to care about 27 things. They're given 100 priorities. Like, they're supposed to not only be software developers, but they're supposed to be full stack 10x engineers. And they're supposed to be able to know Kubernetes and also infrastructure and also this and also, and it's just like, we're expecting a lot. And yeah, so it's one of many priorities for them. It's not the only priority like it is for me.
Totally. Do you have advice that you would give to developers that are working on AI applications to make sure they're like developing them securely from the beginning? It's interesting because I'm not sure how much you follow, but we found at Wiz Research so many vulnerabilities in AI models and the infrastructure, Llama and NVIDIA, a bunch. So it's interesting just in that specific regard. Maybe you touch on it in the book even.
I do. I have a whole section about how to use AI safely. So I actually have this friend named Darren McKee that wrote a book called Uncontrollable. And if you can get past the scary, scary woo-woo, because it's a bit intense, but he talks about the idea of we can't give an AI too much control. Like, even if they become quite right, there are certain decisions that must be made by a human being. It's the same way with the CI/CD. We, you know, you go and you see like a company like Netflix or Microsoft talk about how they do continuous delivery, continuous deployment, and they just let the automated checks do the thing and it goes to prod. Well, 95% of companies don't do that. Almost all of them have a manual stop somewhere that has an approval because we don't trust machines completely yet. And I don't think we should trust AI completely at any point to allow it to be autonomous and make important decisions. So as an example, perhaps you'll let it process refunds, but only up to $25. Do you know what I mean? And something above that perhaps needs some sort of human check. Another thing we can do is have an AI that has another AI check its work. And then again, up to a certain point, and then again, we have a human decide if this makes sense or not. Because quite frankly, we keep seeing them make poor decisions. But even if eventually we see them making good decisions repeatedly, when we give a system complete autonomy and it's able to think for itself, and especially because we don't even understand how it thinks, it seems quite dangerous and irresponsible to allow it to get past that point. And it's a lot of work to do things manually and to have a human check these things. And I know that human beings, so some people call it laziness. I like to call it efficiency. We don't want to repeat things over and over again, and I see why, but I feel like it's extremely important we do not allow laziness or desire for efficiency to make us depend too much. So that would be the number one thing, is not allowing them to have autonomy. But also on top of that, making sure you're not breaking licenses and having shadow IT or shadow AI. We made a bunch of free Semgrep rules, which are totally free for anyone to use with the free product. Just to be clear, you do not have to pay. Oh my gosh! So many companies have devs where like they have a license for one AI, but some other dev prefers another one. And so they're calling that one. And I don't know about you. I've never been sued. And I don't mean to prejudge, but I think I wouldn't like it. I feel confident none of the listeners would like it either. And so like making sure you're not using AI systems that you don't have licenses for, that you don't have policy for, that you're not supposed to be using. That's pretty important. I have a whole list of many things, but I would say at the top would be those two. Like, let's not get sued and let's not give it autonomy it should not have.
I mean, you shouldn't give human developers too much autonomy either. So, I mean, for AI, it makes sense it should be even less.
Mm-hmm. It's an extremely powerful insider threat.
Yeah. Speaking of autonomy in kind of a bit of a different light is open source. And I think it's interesting how it influences like the balance between new features and maintaining security, and kind of how you hold both of those. Another few things that have come up a lot on this podcast: Log4j, XUtils, and kind of, do you think when you look at it that open source software is inherently more or less secure than proprietary software? And how do we approach it in an effective way?
So one of my mentors, Sharif Kusa, he did a big study about open source versus closed source libraries because his job was code review for so many years. And he found them to be approximately the same. Like the same number of vulnerabilities, the same severity of types of vulnerabilities is very similar, unless the framework was specifically supported by a large corporation like Microsoft. So, for instance, .NET, right? So they have a whole team dedicated to its security, but usually it tends to be on par. And so I've heard the argument that, oh, open source is open and therefore it has lots of eyes on it. Yes, but does it have eyes that are experts at finding vulnerabilities? And do those eyes feel like working for free? Because lots of those eyes are finding a 0-day and selling it for money. Because lots of us, it turns out, like money. I'm one of them. I don't like it so much that I would sell a 0-day to a bad person as opposed to reporting it. Well, a lot of us are next level capitalism, and we'll definitely very happily sell a 0-day. Like I was at a conference once, and the guy next to me was telling me how he kept trying to report this bug to this company and they wouldn't. He's like, well, I got to get paid, so I sold it to insert name of not nice group here. And I was like, oh. And then I just got up and went and sat with someone else. I was like, nope.
Bye.
I don't want to be your friend. I gotta go. You're scary.
Why? You might have had a positive influence on him.
Maybe, but he is trying to show off to me by telling me this. Yeah.
So he's a lost cause.
I mean, maybe he's not, but I was like, oh, you're scary. It'd be similar to me to say, like, by the way, I also sell drugs. I'm like, oh, that's scary. I have to
go. You heard it here first on Crying Out Loud.
I have to go. Yeah.
This is a satire podcast. It's okay.
We have a lot of fun doing it. But actually, though, what you do spend your days doing is quite the opposite of selling to bad people, but working on static analysis, or a tool that allows for static analysis. Can you share with listeners what static analysis is good for?
Okay, so this is such a great question. So when I started, so I was a software developer and then I switched to security. And I remember the first time we ran a static analysis tool on one of our apps, and it was like 95% false positives. And I was like, why would you do this when pen testing exists? Why would you even bother doing this when DAST exists? Like, this is just such a piece of complete garbage. And we had to hire an expert for 3 weeks to just look through the results. And all he found after 3 weeks of work, it was $10,000 for the tool to run the scan. It was $30,000 to pay him. So $40,000, we found 20 bugs. And I was like, whoa, these bugs are expensive. So that's $2,000 a bug? What? Like, what? I just couldn't even believe it. And I was like, I just... So that was a first generation static analysis tool, and it does symbolic execution where it tries to actually kind of pretend to execute the code. It goes down every single path. It parses all of your code into pieces like a compiler would. I had to write a compiler for college. So I understand some of this stuff. I would not say I'm an expert on the engine that does static analysis, but the overall high level concepts of making a tree and all of that. And it tries to find all the stuff, and then it reports anything that might be a bug. It also does flow analysis. And modern software static analysis tools also do flow analysis. So it's, you know how we're talking about crossing trust boundaries. So getting input to your app, so that's your source, like where you get it, and then a sink is where you use it. And it's like between those 2 points, did you make sure this was safe to use? And if you didn't, hand slap. And if you did, keep on going. But so those tools are quite slow. So it actually took 3 full days to scan the app the first time with this old static analysis tool. And so fast forward to, I become friends with my friend Clint Gibbler. He goes and gets this job at this weird company called Semgrep. I'm like, why do you work there, dude? He's like, they're so fun. Their tool's really good. So then he comes on my little open source OWASP project show, the OWASP DevSlop show. And he's like, yeah, what if static analysis didn't totally suck? And so what they do is called anti-pattern matching and flow analysis. But so anti-pattern matching is every time we see this in code, it's always bad. Every time we see this pattern, we know it's bad. And so he taught me on the show live, like how to write these like little rules to find things. And so we found all these things together, and it was really cute. And I was like, oh, that's kind of nifty. And that was 2020, and I kind of forgot about them. But he kept working there and kept doing things, and he's like, it's cool. You should come. And so then eventually I got to use it at work, and I'm like, oh, it runs in like 3 minutes instead of 3 days. What? What is happening? And so it can miss some stuff, because if it doesn't have the pattern, it can't find it. right? But if you know what you're looking for, you can build your own pattern. And so I'm like, oh, I have to get my hands dirtier, but I get more of what I want. And so stack analysis, the I call them next generation, they can find any pattern you want, including weird patterns. So for instance, like let's say you're like, we use camel case here in our code, and I will die on this hill. You can go look for anything that's snake case and then be like, excuse me, this is not camel case, you monster. Um, we are not savages here. I have totally had this battle where people are like, we do this here, we do this case here, we do that case here. Anyway,
Spaces versus tabs.
Right? People feel strongly. But so you can go and find all those things and then fix all those things, right? So like, it's nice to be able to just go find like big patterns very quickly.
Like a lot of the limitations you mentioned are applicable to threat detection as well. Like you would run into similar issues with pattern matching for malware when using Yara rules, for example, and a lot of the same, I guess, creativity that you would need to look for malware in new and interesting ways to overcome obfuscation, stuff like that, can probably be applied to looking for, shall we say, creative bugs that no one has ever, mistakes that no one has ever made before, I guess, if that's possible.
Yes. So every 6 months we have something called Hack Week at Semgrep, and it's where you get to put down all your normal work and then you just get to create new features. And that is a thing that I'd like to see if I could do with our engine. Like look through logs for possible attacks, look through, like, I feel like there's so many different things that we could look through, like at Hack Week, not this Hack Week, but the week before, which was 6 months earlier. One guy figured out, I kid you not, how to look at someone's GitHub repo and then design Spotify playlists for them.
I love that.
That's excellent.
I know.
I would
And
pay
like,
money for that.
Right. And then, so it's so funny because like, I guess the whole company super loves Spotify. And so like, then we went on this road trip together last week because we had this big offsite. And so he was like, we're playing this person's Spotify playlist. And so they had a road trip Spotify. And so like, he uses the Semgrep engine somehow to make these playlists, and they're really good.
The next step, I think, is to do like a dating app based on your
Your GitHub
Git
repo,
history.
that's
Yeah.
amazing.
What? That's such a good idea.
Like you could match people who like spaces.
I know what I'm doing for Hack Week next. I'm going to call OkCupid.
I have a question. Going back to, we're like obsessed that you're from Canada, but we talk a lot about here on the podcast about like US policy and US efforts around cybersecurity. And as you noted, Canada can often be quite neutral. But what are things that they're doing that we can learn from that you find that are of note as compared to the rest of the landscape?
Yes. Okay. So we do a bunch of things. So I was the CISO for the 52nd general election in 2015. So I ran the security across all of Canada, including the Arctic, which is surprisingly hard. Running stuff on a 32 kilobit modem is hard. It has to be very small and fast. And so a thing that Canada does is it visits other countries that are working on their democracy, and it offers to share all their software and systems with them, which is pretty cool. And they offer to teach them leading. So as long as it's not our election year, which PS this year is our election year, like this month is busy. But the other 3 years, if we have a majority government, they're pretty chill. And so they'll go and just visit other countries, try to learn from them, try to share with them. So that's one cool thing that they do.
It makes us want to do more research on Canada and keep it in the loop in the pod. So thank you.
You were like, as our first Canadian guest, I feel like you've received like all of the questions we ever thought of for anyone Canadian. So you sort of set the stage for future Canadian guests. I hope you feel proud of yourself.
Yes. I have more suggestions for guests after.
Ooh.
Oh, your friends from Canada. We'd love to hear. Awesome. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. It has been so interesting, and I cannot wait to read the book and for our listeners to get to tune in.
Oh, Thank you so much for having me. It's been such an utter pleasure. And I I love the name of your podcast. I think it's really punny.
Thank you.
Oh, we love the puns.
If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe and share a link to the podcast, but not your cloud keys. And as always, if your cloud security strategy is making you cry, don't worry, just cry out cloud.